Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Harvey Girls, Women Who Opened the West, by Lesley Poling-Kempes. Narrated by Joana Garcia. Introduction. Talking with women who were Harvey Girls in the early part of this century confirmed two suppositions. One, they were women who wanted to know life beyond their immediate family sphere. And two, they were interested in experiencing for themselves the unknowns of the Southwest. They wanted to be part of the adventure taking place along the railroads of the West. Most of these women needed to work. Many used the need to work as an excuse to leave home. It may not have been a conscious motivation, but the women who went to work with Fred Harvey wanted to explore their own potentials, test their individual characters, and expand their knowledge of themselves and the world they were part of through the experience. In a conversation with a Southwestern newspaperman about the Harvey Girls, it was brought to my attention that they were, after all, only waitresses. I wanted to dispute his insinuation that they were unworthy of closer study, but at the time was not certain why. They were only waitresses. They served a 4-course meal in under 30 minutes, perhaps an impressive feat among restaurateurs, but not really worthy of historical recognition. They were not paid so well as to be considered better off than most other people in their communities. As a group, they did little or nothing actively to advance women's rights. They weren't highly educated, and there are no towns or buildings or roads named for them in a region where virtually every mountain, path, and community is named in honor of some early citizen. The Harvey Girls were waitresses. They were also single women between the ages of 18 and 30 who answered newspaper and magazine advertisements in the East and Midwest to go out into the Southwestern Territory to work for Fred Harvey and his hotel or restaurant chain along the Santa Fe Railway. Some 100,000 Harvey Girls came west between 1883 and the late 1950s, when the Harvey system declined as the railroads lost ground to the airlines. Of those 100,000, approximately half returned home after their Harvey contracts were completed. But an equal number remained in the Southwest, many marrying and settling on ranches and farms, in mining communities and railroad towns. If there is a moral to the history of the westward movement, wrote E.D. Branch, it is this: the transcendent importance of small things and of unimportant people. The Harvey Girls were a group of unimportant people, women who came west to work, to marry, who became absorbed into the vast lands of the Southwest. The new social history focuses on the affairs of ordinary people and seeks to unearth the lives and details of those whose names are not known, but whose contributions are worthy of attention. In examining their lives, we examine the origins of our own. The Harvey Girls summons up for many the image of Judy Garland, who starred in an MGM movie of the same name in the 1940s. Although there was nothing offensive or overtly misrepresentative about the movie, it perpetuated the general public's unrealistic image of the Harvey Girls. The film, like much fiction found in popular magazines of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, made the Harvey Girl out to be a kind of mythical figure, rather than an active contributor in the American West. This sort of attention may have endeared the Harvey Girls to readers and moviegoers, but it did little to tell their story accurately, or locate their place in the greater history of women in the West. The nostalgic stories about pretty uniformed heroines, which became the only historic renderings of the Harvey Girls, ignore the controversy that often surrounded them. The suspicion in many communities that they were really prostitutes in disguise, or that they were not acceptable, not nice girls, simply because they were waitresses. Many Harvey girls carried the burden of these social labels throughout their working lives. The story of the Harvey Girls is unique in American history. The Lowell factory girls of Massachusetts shared certain aspects of their work and social background with the Harvey Girls and are briefly studied and compared with them later in this book. But their history has neither the geographical scope nor the diversity of individual background found in the stories of the women who worked for Fred Harvey throughout the Southwest. The story of the Harvey Girls is a story of women, but more importantly, it is a story about women and the Western Railroad. There were few women working along any American railroad in the late 19th century, or even well into the 20th. But the Harvey Girls could only have appeared in the West, where there was a new country in search of a new identity, where great distances spanned only by the railroad made working at the Harvey houses a complete way of life. The West had communities whose only history was that of the railroad. Harvey Girls and Harvey employees, along with Santa Fe Railroad men, were often the founding fathers and mothers of entire towns. The Harvey Girls contended with the social stigmas attached to all single working women in early 20th century America. Eastern attitudes found their way west as surely as Eastern dreams. Women who worked were socially inferior and morally suspect, but the West had elbow room, and Fred Harvey made use of it in establishing his own idea of the working woman. His employees were never to be called waitresses. They were Harvey Girls. They were expected to act like Harvey Girls 24 hours a day. They were told where to live, what time to go to bed, whom to date, even what to wear down to the last detail of makeup and jewelry. And although the majority of these young women were most certainly not out to attract attention as advocates of women's rights, the Harvey Girls demonstrated a dedication to their jobs and an independence in their lives that would later become common among young women involved in the pursuit of their chosen profession. It was all done under the protective and fatherly arm of the Fred Harvey system. But it was a system that, for its time, was fair to women, and one that honored hard work and loyalty with security and benefits. Fred Harvey, himself an English immigrant, was to be called civilizer of the American West again and again by historians and journalists of his time. This title reflects the attitude of the era. Indian and Hispanic culture, already well-rooted and flourishing in the Southwest, was not civilized. Harvey and the railroad brought Anglo-American culture west, civilizing the territories of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Texas, and California with American language, food, dress, money, and values. And the Harvey Girls embodied this notion within their ranks. Only white women were hired as Harvey waitresses. European immigrant women were acceptable, but there were never black Harvey Girls, and only a very small number of Hispanic and Indian women ever served in Harvey Girl uniforms. Harvey houses were islands of American culture linked to the homeland by the Santa Fe rails. In the chapters that follow, the Harvey Girls are revealed through their own words, through their own memories of the Harvey system and the people that made the Harvey standard into an imposing and impressive business. This book is based on interviews and letters gathered from 77 individuals in 9 states. The emphasis has been necessarily placed upon Harvey girls who worked from the early 20th century through the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Harvey girls who worked earlier are not living. Those who worked after World War II were not part of the most successful era of Harvey and the Santa Fe. The years from the early part of this century to the late 1930s were the golden years of the Harvey girls. Women who worked for Harvey after this time were members of a system that was diminishing in importance as the trains that served the Harvey houses became less traveled with the advent of air and automobile traffic in the West. This book does not attempt to analyze the Harvey girls as a social or economic force, nor does it systematically study Harvey employment practices, company prejudices, or corporate attitudes. Had this been my intention, I would have been sadly disappointed, as there are no Harvey personnel records available for historians to ponder. There is no official data other than what I have gathered myself through interviews and letters and derived from the few collections of historical and usually romanticized writings about the Harvey girls. The majority of women and men interviewed were retired, many for 20 years or more. Some of them were active, some were bedridden and spoke of their past, 40, 50, even 60 years ago, as the best years of their lives. Often, this meant remembering the transition from childhood to young adulthood, from life on a rural farm to life in a thriving urban community. For some, it was even the beginning of life beyond poverty and struggle, a life where the promises of the American dream began to take form, and the land of opportunity became something tangible beneath their feet. Because the railroad that once put their communities on the map no longer operates passenger service to most of the Southwest, I had to drive hundreds of miles into the great nowheres of America to reach former Harvey girls, head waitresses, busboys, managers, chefs, and cooks, Santa Fe engineers, and telegraphers. Their nostalgia for a past that was centered around the great transcontinental trains often became my own as I was taken to visit empty Harvey houses and deserted or half-used depots in towns like Waynoka, Oklahoma, Newton, Kansas, Kingman, Arizona, and Gainesville, Texas. Retired Harvey employees, like their partners, the Santa Fe Railroad men, continue to follow daily train schedules and listen for the whistles of engineers, as ingrained in their memories as the passing of the seasons. Even after Fred Harvey died in 1901, his employees went on saying, "I work for Fred Harvey," as if he were alive and still actively running the system. Harvey the person may have passed away, but the concept among Harvey employees of a family of people working for one man continued for 50 years. Harvey girls, chefs, managers, bellboys, and bakers loved to talk about their years with the Harvey houses. With only a handful of exceptions, they answered inquiries about the details of their lives and work enthusiastically and openly. Those who did not, former Harvey girls I learned of through their friends, or to whom I spoke directly but who declined to be interviewed for this book, often refused because of a fear of being discovered. Their working woman's background was still perceived as a threat to their often hard-earned social status. Several had married very prominent men, and even the passage of half a century could not erase in their minds the stigma that was attached to a woman who had worked as a waitress. But these were the rare exceptions. Harvey girls and their colleagues eagerly discussed all aspects of their work, and they worked hard. They put in 10-hour days and 6- and 7-day weeks. Their work in Harvey restaurants and hotels was physical and demanding, as serving the public, especially the travel-weary public, always is. But the camaraderie within the system provided a major source of support and energy to all who worked at the Harvey houses. Harvey employees, even today, though they are retired and scattered throughout the Southwest and the rest of the United States, form a family unit rare in American business. Oral historians and other collectors and investigators of recent history must separate the real from the almost real and tell the true picture from the embellished memory. Nostalgia for lost youth, as Julie Roy Jeffrey found, often colors the memory. Most former Harvey girls remembered the good times, the satisfying and happy times of their work. And when listening to the reminiscences of the Harvey girls, it is important to remember that they lived and worked in a time and a society that did not always applaud their choice to go west as single women, even when made out of economic necessity. They did not live in a time that admired spunk and independence in working women, despite the American West and its promises of freedom and space. That promise, historians are beginning to realize, was reserved for its male immigrants. The myth of the West was largely a male dream, an adventure of danger, risk, excitement, and high stakes. Neither women nor Indians counted. We have learned that both women and Indians did count. The extent of their contributions is still being uncovered. It is only recently, in a society interested in its women's history, that women, like the Harvey girls, have been hailed as contributors to the American story. Only a few decades ago, the women in this book would have told their life stories to a stranger reluctantly, questioning the premise behind so many inquiries into their daily lives. Their pride and enthusiasm for the work they did, the role they played along the Santa Fe Railway, has only now found an appreciative audience. One would like to believe that all the Harvey girls were adventurers, spirited single women with a vision of excitement and freedom luring them west on their own. But most were prompted by economic necessity and the knowledge that the West had an abundance of single men. Even so, these women took a considerable risk by stepping on board a train in Chicago or St. Louis or Kansas City, rattling across deserts and mountains and prairies to end up on a platform in some southwestern town where cowboys and miners and farmers eked out a living. Places like Raton, New Mexico, and Williams, Arizona, had only a handful of female residents, school teachers, missionaries, and cooks, and a few prostitutes and dance hall girls. But women were still scarce. The Southwest was still rough and isolated, and the Harvey girls joined the ranks of American trailblazers when they set down their bags and settled into these early railroad communities. The Harvey girls were just waitresses. Their counterparts were just cowboys, just miners with nothing to call their own but a mule and a pick. Just trappers without families or homes, farmers fighting the elements to grow a few acres of wheat, stage drivers and stockmen, prospectors and cattle ranchers, railroad men following the rails, just ordinary folks, some educated and well-to-do, others poor but hopeful, and all seeking life in a young land. Following the Santa Fe Railway and Fred Harvey across the Southwest means following the wagon ruts of the old Santa Fe Trail. The history of the Santa Fe Railway is infused with the history of the Great Trail that was its predecessor. And all three, the old trail, the railroad, and the Harvey houses, are linked by a shared ulterior motive: to bring west the trade and culture of the white man and eventually white woman. The years which saw Fred Harvey and the railroad at their combined greatest also witnessed the transformation of the Southwest from a largely unknown desert and mountain wilderness to a popular region of small, thriving cities, a region that became a mecca for American and foreign tourism. The Southwest became less the rugged frontier than the exotic backyard of America in the early decades of the 20th century. The Santa Fe Railway and Fred Harvey and the thousands of women known as Harvey Girls accelerated a change in Eastern and Midwestern attitudes toward the areas known today as the states of Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. The history of the Santa Fe Trail and the Santa Fe Railway have been aptly chronicled, but the phenomenon of Fred Harvey has only recently found its way into the history of American business. Here is the story of the Harvey Girls. The history of the Southwest would be incomplete without them. Chapter 1. The Old Santa Fe Trail. The story of the Old Santa Fe Trail is a most thrilling one. When the famous highway was established across the Great Plains as a line of communication to the shores of the blue Pacific, the only method of travel was by the slow freight caravan drawn by patient oxen, or the lumbering stagecoach with its complement of 4 or 6 mules. There was ever to be faced an attack by those devils of the desert, the Cheyennes, Comanches, and Kiowas. Along its route, the remains of men, animals, and the wrecks of camps and wagons told a story of suffering, robbery, and outrage more impressive than any language. Now the tourist or businessman makes the journey in palace cars, and there is nothing to remind him of the danger or desolation of border days. W. F. Cody, Buffalo Bill. When Fred Harvey and the Santa Fe Railway first took their partnership west in the 1870s and 1880s, they often followed the path blazed by the old Santa Fe Trail. The flavor established by Harvey and the railroaders owes much to the historic old trail that preceded them. The early years of the railroad were often difficult, but they were easy in comparison to the opening of the Santa Fe Trail 40 years before. Unlike the other 2 trails to the west, the Santa Fe was primarily a trade route. The Oregon Trail was the major route to California and served immigrants, settlers, and gold seekers. The Mormon Trail was pioneered by the group whose name it bears and whose city, Salt Lake City, it established. Although the Santa Fe Trail never boasted as many travelers, it is the oldest of the 3 and possibly the most colorful in legend and culture. Its course was carved out by the American Indians, Spanish conquistadores, French trappers, and American traders, and was frequented by the great herds of buffalo that once roamed the Great Plains. The Santa Fe Trail began in what became Independence, Missouri, and ended in remote Spanish Indian Santa Fe. There were 800 miles of poorly marked, often treacherous ground between the flat, monotonous plains of Kansas, the dry, waterless desert of Indian Territory, and the seemingly uncrossable mountains of the Rockies, through what is now southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. A crossing of the Santa Fe Trail from either direction was not an easy undertaking. but the rewards in trade in precious metals and eventually in territorial acquisition for the United States made the obstacles worth overcoming. The Santa Fe Trail was probably first used by Francisco de Coronado and his men in 1540 on their famous trip through the Southwest in search of the 7 cities of gold. By the early 1800s, when Americans first traveled along the trail, the town of Santa Fe was an isolated village of mud and adobe houses owned by Spain and connected to the greater world only through its neighbor to the south, Mexico. In 1804, a merchant from Kaskaskia, Illinois, William Morrison, sent Baptiste Lalande, a French Creole, to Santa Fe with pack animals loaded with goods. Lalande reached Santa Fe and fell in love with its old Spanish social customs, simple lifestyle, friendly men, and exotic women. Instead of returning with Morrison's fortune, Lalande settled in Santa Fe, where he spent the remainder of his life in comfort and luxury. Lalande was followed by James Purcell, called Pursley in Lieutenant Zebulon M. Pike's account, a carpenter from Kentucky. Purcell was not headed for Santa Fe, but planned to trade on the Great Plains. His convoy's plans changed when their horses were stolen by Indians. Purcell and his men walked the prairie until they were found by another trading party headed up the Missouri River. Purcell became a well-known trader among the Indians in the mountains of Colorado and was asked to represent them to the Mexican governor in Santa Fe. In 1805, Purcell arrived in Santa Fe and asked the governor to allow the Indians to remain in Colorado Territory. Like Lalande, Purcell was smitten by the hospitality and charm of the Spanish hamlet and stayed to become another of its adopted residents. One of the most familiar explorers of the Spanish territories is Lieutenant Zebulon Pike, for whom the famous peak was named. Pike was 27 when he set out from St. Louis in 1806. Although he followed the Santa Fe Trail a considerable distance, he veered north to the mountains at the Purgatory River instead of south to the Spanish frontier. After near disaster in the winter mountains of Colorado, Pike found the Rio Grande in January of 1807 and built a fort. One of Pike's party was Dr. John Robinson, sent by Morrison to find Lalande. Pike sent Robinson to Santa Fe in the guise of a bounty hunter, though he was really seeking first-hand information about the Spanish military for the United States government. The Spanish were not ignorant of Pike's ulterior motive and sent 100 of their men to Pike's fort on the Rio Grande. The Spaniards were not hostile, but they took Pike back with them to Santa Fe. Pike traveled in safety and comfort and witnessed places and events no ordinary American could have seen in New Mexico at the turn of the 19th century. Although Pike was not immediately impressed with Santa Fe, the area gradually charmed him. After a trip south with his Spanish escort to Chihuahua through the Rio Grande Valley, Pike was sent home via the Texas border to St. Louis. Although Pike's mission to the Southwest may have been predominantly military, and he gathered most of his information in order to help the United States in its eventual infiltration of Spanish territories, Pike's account of his year in the Southwest also inspired hundreds of traders and explorers to take their chances on the Santa Fe Trail. The Spanish, who had been good-natured and tolerant of Pike, Lalande, and Purcell, were, however, not about to give up their dominance of New Mexico trade to Americans who wanted to flood the market with their goods. By 1809, American traders on the Santa Fe Trail were arrested by Spanish soldiers and thrown into jail without trial with lengthy and often indeterminate sentences. Despite the possibilities of imprisonment, the loss of their goods.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?